He was a respected heart surgeon, a man of science, who didn't believe in anything he couldn't measure. But then, during a routine operation, he died. For 6 minutes, his heart stopped. And what he saw on the other side shattered everything he thought he knew about medicine, life, and the human soul. He returned not with a medical breakthrough, but with a message, a warning. According to him, the greatest lie in modern medicine is not just harming patients, it's destroying lives. What if illness isn't just physical? What if your pain is trying to tell you something, and no one is listening? This doctor was shown a future where hospitals are full, not because of new diseases, but because humanity has lost its soul. If you've ever wondered what really happens when we die, or felt that medicine treats symptoms, but ignores the truth, then you need to hear what this man saw after his heart stopped beating. Because once you know what he knows, you'll never look at life, or death, the same way again. I've spent the last 23 years of my life inside operating rooms. Heart surgeries, lung resections, trauma repairs, you name it, I've done it. To many, I was the miracle worker, the one who stood between life and death. I always believed that science had the final say, that the body was a machine and I was the mechanic. A good one of the best. That belief held strong until the day I died on my own operating table. It started like any other morning. I woke up early, reviewed some patient files, drank the same bitter coffee I always did. But that day, I wasn't preparing to operate on someone else. I was preparing to be the patient. For months, I had ignored the signs. Shortness of breath, fatigue, pressure in my chest. I told myself it was stress, that I was pushing too hard. But deep down, I knew it was my heart. Eventually, a cardiologist friend of mine convinced me to do some tests. The results were clear. I needed a valve replacement, sooner rather than later. I chose a colleague I trusted deeply. I even joked with him as I was being prepped for surgery. "Don't mess this up. I still have some miracles left to perform." He smiled, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I brushed it off. I was in control. I always was. As they rolled me into the OR, I remember the cold of the table, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the soft murmur of the nurses and techs preparing the instruments. I watched the anesthesia drip begin and felt the world start to blur. My final thought was strangely calm. Let's get this over with. Darkness. Then light. Not a tunnel, not a flash, but a gradual shift, like the dawn breaking behind closed eyelids. I felt myself rising, weightless, like air separating from water. I opened my eyes, or what felt like eyes, and saw something that stole the breath I no longer had. There I was, lying still, chest open, my face pale. The surgical team was scrambling. One nurse was crying. My colleague was barking orders, his voice cracking. I had coded. My heart had stopped. But I wasn't panicked. I wasn't scared. I was fascinated. I floated above them, a silent observer. I heard their words, even the ones unspoken. I could feel their fear, their desperation. But I also felt something else, a stillness, a presence, something just behind me, watching with me. Time became strange, at once suspended and accelerated. I saw moments out of sequence, my wife waiting in the hallway, clutching her phone. My daughter lighting a candle at church, whispering my name. My mother, long gone, sitting on a park bench we used to visit when I was a boy. It was as if time had folded in on itself, and I was walking across its seams. Then came the pull. Not gravity, not force, more like longing, a beckoning from somewhere far yet achingly familiar. I turned, again, not with a body but with will, and saw something beyond the operating room, a space that shimmered, not with light, but with meaning, with understanding, a space that called to the very core of who I was, beneath the doctor, beneath the man, and for the first time in my life, I felt small, not insignificant, but held, like I was part of something infinite and kind, something that had always been there, just outside the reach of my stethoscope. I wasn't ready to call it heaven, not yet, but I knew this. I had stepped into a realm where nothing was hidden, where truth wasn't spoken, it was known. And what I would come to learn there, in the space between life and death, would unravel everything I believed about medicine, healing, and the soul. But that's just the beginning. There was no heartbeat, no breath, no brain activity, at least not in the body lying on that table. But I was still thinking, still being. And that was the first crack in everything I thought I knew about consciousness. As a doctor, I had been taught that the mind is a product of the brain. Shut off the brain, and the mind disappears. Yet here I was, completely separated from my body, with thoughts more vivid and expansive than I'd ever experienced. I floated just beneath the ceiling, watching my colleagues trying to bring me back. The defibrillator paddles shocked my chest. My arms twitched, but I felt nothing. I could see the monitor flatlining, hear the urgency in the surgeon's voice, and still, somehow, I was calm. What struck me most was the feeling. The atmosphere around me wasn't just visual or auditory, it was emotional, spiritual, alive. Every thought I had seemed to shape the space around me. Fear created distance, curiosity pulled me forward, and love. When I thought of my family, love glowed like a thread connecting me to something far greater than this moment. That's when I felt the shift. A new presence entered the space, not through the door, not physically. It simply was, all around me. Enormous, intimate, impossible to explain. Like the echo of every prayer I never dared to say out loud. I didn't see a form, but I knew I was being seen, entirely. Not judged, not evaluated, just known. This presence communicated without words. It poured understanding directly into me. I didn't hear a voice, but I received meaning. And the first message was simple. You were never just the body. I felt as if a curtain had been lifted. My entire life, I had dissected humans into parts, hearts, lungs, kidneys, minds. But now, I saw clearly that we are more than the sum of our organs, infinitely more. The next message came like a wave. You forgot who you are. And in that instant, I saw flashes of my childhood. Before medicine, before ambition, before ego. I saw a boy who used to speak to the stars, who used to believe in invisible things, who felt deeply, who listened more than he spoke. I had buried him beneath titles, textbooks, and sterile procedures. But he was still there, buried under years of clinical detachment. Then something astonishing happened. I was given a choice, not in words, not in options, but a soul-level awareness. I could move forward into a space of unimaginable peace, or I could return, not because I had to, but because something unfinished was calling me back. At that moment, I saw faces, so many faces, patients I had treated, some I had saved, others I had failed. I felt their emotions, their pain, their trust in me. It wasn't judgment, it was understanding. And then, like a whisper from the very center of my being, came the realization. Healing is not just physical, and the greatest medicine is presence. Everything inside me trembled with that truth. And suddenly I wanted to go back, not to prove anything, not to be a hero, but to change the way I lived, the way I saw people, the way I practiced medicine. I didn't say yes, I just felt it, and the presence responded, not with applause, not with approval, but with love, an overwhelming, unconditional love that wrapped around my soul and gave me the strength I didn't know I still had. That's when I fell, not physically, but with speed and force, like being sucked through dimensions, pulled back into time and gravity. My body was cold, heavy, pain bloomed in my chest like fire, the machines screamed, and suddenly, I was back, but I would never be the same. If what I've shared so far has touched something in you, if you've ever wondered whether there's more to life than what we can measure, I invite you to stay with me through the rest of this story. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. What I'm about to reveal next will challenge everything you think you know about medicine and the soul. Coming back into my body was like being stuffed into a space that had become too small for me. Everything felt heavier. My limbs, my lungs, even my thoughts. I was intubated, unable to speak, barely able to move, but I was awake, and I remembered everything. The presence, the silence, the knowing. I tried to blink, to signal that I was conscious, but no one noticed at first. They were busy documenting my vitals, adjusting IV lines, whispering with cautious optimism. I wasn't supposed to be alive. Not after what happened. Flatlined for nearly 6 minutes. But I was here. The next few days blurred into one long haze of tests and recovery. Everyone around me chalked up my survival to a miracle of modern medicine. But they were wrong. The miracle wasn't that my heart restarted. It was what happened while it had stopped. As soon as I could speak, I tried to tell a nurse. I described the room, who was there, what was said. She laughed politely, assuming it was the anesthesia talking. But I knew what I saw, and it wasn't a dream. It was more real than anything I'd ever experienced. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain. People in my world, the medical world, weren't ready for that kind of truth. I understood. I wouldn't have been ready either, just a week earlier. But I was different now. Once I was discharged, I returned home to recover. Lying in my own bed, surrounded by quiet, I couldn't stop replaying what had happened. The messages I'd received, the feelings I'd had. There was one that kept echoing inside me, like a bell I couldn't unring. You forgot who you are. I didn't understand it at first. I was a doctor, a husband, a father. My life was full. But slowly, painfully, I began to see what that presence had meant. I had spent decades doing instead of being, treating bodies instead of seeing souls. I measured success in numbers, survival rates, hours worked, procedures completed, but I never measured how fully I had shown up for a single patient, how often I'd met them with presence instead of protocol, and worse, I had dismissed what I couldn't explain. I remembered a young woman, only 22, who had once told me she saw her grandmother during cardiac arrest. She described floating above her body, watching the doctors work on her. I'd nodded politely, then added a note to her file. Hallucination due to hypoxia. I had labeled something sacred as delusion. Now I knew better. One night, weeks after my return, I had a dream. Or maybe it was more than a dream. In it, I was back in that place of light. Only this time, I was walking through a corridor lined with mirrors. Each one reflected not my face, but moments in time. Times when I had the chance to truly connect with someone, and didn't. A patient who cried while I stared at a clipboard. A child who reached for my hand, and I pulled away to answer a phone call. A dying man who asked if there was anything after this life, and I changed the subject. Every reflection carried a weight, not of guilt, but of lost opportunity. I woke up in tears. That's when I knew I couldn't go back to being the same doctor. The world of medicine, for all its brilliance, was missing something vital, something I had touched beyond death. We were experts in fixing the physical, but blind to the spiritual. We could cut, stitch, prescribe, and repair, but we had forgotten how to truly heal. And now, with this new awareness burning in my chest like a second heartbeat, I began to wonder, what if everything we believed about life and death was incomplete? After weeks of physical healing, I found myself far more wounded in ways no scan could detect. I wasn't just recovering from cardiac arrest. I was unraveling. Everything I had believed about life, death, the mind, the soul. It was all coming apart in my hands like dry cloth. And then, late one night, when my house was silent and my wife was asleep beside me, I closed my eyes and whispered a question into the darkness. Who are you? I didn't expect an answer, but something heard me. I don't know how to explain what happened next. My body remained in bed, but my awareness, it lifted. No pain, no effort. I was simply there, in that same dimension I had touched during my surgery, but this time I was not hovering. I was invited. I stood, if that's even the right word, in a space that wasn't physical, but somehow more real than anything I'd ever known. Everything around me glowed with intention. Colors I'd never seen on Earth pulsed in harmony, like living frequencies. I felt every sound as sensation, every light as meaning. And then, it arrived, not with fanfare, not as a figure or a god from any scripture, but as a presence, a being so vast and intimate that I felt both entirely exposed and completely safe, like a child climbing into the lap of something eternal. This presence didn't speak in words, but everything was understood. Thoughts flowed like rivers. Truth wasn't taught, it was absorbed, and it saw me, completely. Every memory I had suppressed, every motive I'd hidden, even from myself, every mask I'd worn, every lie I told to protect my pride. I expected judgment, but what I felt was compassion, infinite, gentle, stern but never cruel. I was asked, not in words but in something purer than language, "Do you want to see what your life has truly been?" I said yes. Suddenly I was standing inside my own timeline, not just watching it, but feeling it. Every moment replayed, not from my point of view, but from the perspective of those I had touched. Patients, family, strangers. I didn't just remember, I experienced. I felt the fear of a mother whose baby I couldn't save. I felt the quiet hope of a man whose hand I held before surgery, even though I don't remember doing it. I felt the coldness of the receptionist I brushed past without a word, and the gratitude of the nurse whose ideas I once actually listened to. It wasn't about success or failure. It was about presence, about the intention behind every choice, the ripple of every small act. And then I was shown the future, not in specifics, not like watching a movie, but in possibility. I saw what would unfold if I continued living as I had been, respected, wealthy, admired, but disconnected, empty. A healer who never touched what mattered most. And I saw what could happen if I chose a different path. One rooted in compassion, in soul, in truth. The way wouldn't be easy. Some would laugh, some would turn away. But those who were ready, they would remember something through me, something sacred. I turned toward the presence again, overwhelmed. I didn't know how to go back and live differently. I didn't know how to be what I now knew. And again, without words, I received the answer. You don't need to know. You only need to be honest. The rest will come. Tears poured from a place beyond emotion. I wasn't just being guided. I was being loved into remembering who I truly was. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my bed, the ceiling above me. My wife was still asleep. The room was unchanged, but I wasn't. I felt that presence still with me, as if a part of it had come back inside me. And for the first time since the day I died, I wasn't afraid. It didn't come all at once. The full weight of the experience settled in gradually, like fog rolling in over a quiet field. The more I sat with what I had seen, what I had felt, the more I realized how much of my life had been lived in shadow. Not darkness exactly, just disconnection. A few nights after the vision, I couldn't sleep. I went to my study, sat in the leather chair where I used to review surgical journals and medical charts, and I just breathed. No distractions, no data, just stillness. And that's when it began. I didn't fall asleep, but I left the room. Suddenly I was back in that same dimension where the presence had met me. But this time, I stood alone in a vast space with no sky, no floor, only memory, like I was inside the consciousness of my own soul. Before me, scenes from my life began to appear, but not like watching home videos. No, I was in them, fully immersed, every detail vivid, every emotion alive. The first was my childhood. I saw myself at 7, sitting alone in the backyard, talking to the stars. I used to believe someone was listening, that the universe wasn't empty. I had long forgotten that little boy. Then I watched my teenage self, eager to prove, desperate to be someone important. I felt the insecurity hidden beneath my ambition, the loneliness behind my drive to succeed, not to heal, but to matter. Then came the years of medical school, internships, the long nights in trauma wards. I saw patients I barely remembered. Some I saved, others I lost. But what struck me wasn't the outcome. It was how present I had been, or hadn't been. There was a woman in her 60s, dying of cancer. She had asked me, in a trembling voice, "Do you think we go somewhere after?" I had dismissed her question gently, told her to get some rest, that we'd talk more in the morning. She died that night. I felt her disappointment, not anger, just sadness. She had wanted someone to meet her in her fear, to hold her question, even if no answer could be given. And I had chosen comfort over connection. Scene after scene unfolded like that, not to shame me, not to accuse me, but to awaken me. I saw how every moment of avoidance, every rushed conversation, every sterile interaction was a missed opportunity to love. And then I felt it, not guilt, but a kind of sacred sorrow, the kind that says, You were meant for more. But it wasn't all regret. I was shown moments I had forgotten entirely. A quiet hand on a shoulder, a simple smile during post-op rounds, a time I held an elderly man's hand while his family wept. In those moments, I had touched something deeper than the body. I had touched spirit. And those were the moments that shone brightest in this space beyond time. It became clear to me that what matters most in life is not what we do, but how we do it. Not what we accomplish, but who we are in the presence of another human soul. And then came the final scene. It was the night before my surgery. I was in my office, alone, reviewing some final notes. I had looked in the mirror, tired, aged, and whispered to myself, I just want this to be over. But now, standing outside that moment, I saw it differently. I wasn't just tired of the surgery. I was tired of myself, tired of performing, tired of pretending I had all the answers. A part of me wanted to die, not out of despair, but out of the desperate need for something to change. And it did. That's when I felt the presence again, surrounding me, holding me. Now you see. Now you choose. It was never about punishment. It was about truth. About being shown who I truly was, beneath the roles, the masks, the pride. And I wept, not from pain, but from the freedom that truth brings. When I opened my eyes again, back in my study, the lamp beside me was still glowing. The room was quiet, but inside me, nothing was the same. For days after the life review, I walked around in a haze, functioning, smiling, responding, but no longer seeing the world the same way. My colleagues spoke to me in clinical language, discussing numbers, procedures, discharge notes. But I could no longer unsee what had been revealed to me. And then, one night, I asked again into the silence, what do I need to understand about all this? That was when the truth came. Not in a dream, not in a vision, but in knowing. Clear, undeniable. It dropped into my mind like a stone into still water, and the ripple it created reached every belief I had ever held. The greatest mistake of modern medicine is that we treat the body like a machine and forget that it is a vessel of spirit. That's it. That simple. That devastating. We cut, we medicate, we suppress, we numb. We patch up symptoms and call it healing. But we rarely stop to ask why the disease appeared in the first place. We rarely ask what the soul is trying to express through the illness. We assume illness is an enemy, something to battle. But in that other realm, I saw clearly, illness is not punishment. It's a message, a sacred alarm clock, a last cry from the soul to return to wholeness. Some of the sickest people I had treated weren't dying from organs failing. They were dying from loneliness, from suppressed grief, from lives lived out of alignment with truth. Their bodies were simply echoing what their spirits could no longer hold in silence. And I had missed it, again and again. Not because I was heartless, but because I had been trained to look at flesh, not essence. I was taught to trust lab results more than intuition, to numb pain instead of listen to it. The presence had shown me. Every human is not just a body or a diagnosis. They are a constellation of emotion, memory, soul, and purpose. And unless we treat the whole, we treat nothing. I remembered a man in his 40s who had suffered repeated heart attacks. His scans were clean, his arteries open, but his heart kept failing. He once told me, "It feels like I'm dying from the inside out." We ran more tests, more procedures, and eventually he did die. Not from physical failure, but from the weight of a life unlived. He had carried grief in his chest for decades, and no scalpel could cut that out. Now, with this clarity, I realized, we are not trained to see the root. We are trained to silence the signal. And that is the lie. The lie that says healing is only physical. The lie that says if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. The lie that tells us the soul is separate from science. But real healing, true healing, begins with presence, with listening, with connection, with remembering that every patient carries a universe inside them, not just a disease. I began writing down everything I was remembering. At first, I kept it private. I was afraid of what my peers would think, afraid of losing credibility. But that fear quickly became irrelevant. How could I stay silent when I had been given so much truth? It was no longer about me. It was about them, the people suffering in silence, misdiagnosed not just medically, but spiritually. The patients whose pain had a message no one ever asked to hear. And so, I asked the presence one more time, what do I do with all of this? The answer was immediate. Begin with one. See them. Really see them. It wasn't about building a new hospital or preaching to the world. It was about changing how I looked into the eyes of a single human being, shifting my posture from expert to witness, from fixer to listener. Because sometimes, what a soul needs most is not a cure, but to be seen, to be known, to be reminded that they are not broken, just waiting to remember who they are. And that is where true medicine begins. I used to think time was a straight line, one second after another, like links in a chain, predictable, measurable, real. That belief worked well in surgery. Every minute counted, every moment could be documented. But in the space I had touched during my near-death experience, time was something else entirely. It was not linear. It was alive. One evening, after another long day wrestling with the memories of all I had seen and unlearned, I found myself drifting again. Not asleep, not awake, somewhere in between. And just like before, my awareness expanded, as if I were stepping outside of the clock that ruled my waking life. I stood in a realm where past, present, and future folded over each other like waves on the same ocean. And there, in the stillness, the presence returned. Not in form, not in voice, but in the same undeniable knowing. It guided me gently, and I felt a question rise within me. What is coming? I didn't mean politically. I didn't mean medically. I meant spiritually. Where are we going as a species? And the answer came, not in prophecy, but in possibility. Suddenly, I was shown glimpses, not fixed events, but potentials, future branches of our collective path, what we could become, depending on the choices we make now. I saw a version of Earth that was raw and aching, people more connected to machines than to each other, children born into a world where silence was feared and distraction was worshipped. I saw hospitals filled with people whose bodies broke down not from germs or genes, but from hopelessness, from the slow erosion of the soul. And I understood. This was the future we were creating by default, by forgetting who we are. But then, the scene shifted, and I was shown another possibility. A future where the invisible was honored just as much as the visible, where intuition was not mocked, but cultivated, where doctors worked with the soul, not against it, where healing wasn't just about removing disease, but about restoring meaning. In that version of the world, children were taught to meditate before they learned to multiply. Dying was no longer feared, but embraced as part of a larger cycle, and medicine had become an act of reverence, not control. I wept, because I saw how close we are to both outcomes, how the future isn't waiting for us, it's responding to us. We are the ones shaping it. Every thought, every act of kindness or cruelty, every time we choose truth over comfort, we bend the timeline in one direction or the other. I realized something else too. The sickness in our world isn't just physical, it's existential. We've forgotten our place in the fabric of life. We've lost our reverence. We think we are separate, doctors from patients, science from spirit, life from death. But nothing is separate here. Everything is woven together. I asked the presence with trembling awareness, is it too late? And the answer came. Not in fear, not in warning, but in love. Not if you remember. That word, remember, held such power. It didn't mean to recall facts. It meant to reconnect. To remember ourselves as part of something whole, something sacred, something that has been waiting for us to awaken. Then I saw myself, not the version sitting in bed recovering, or the one who once walked hospital corridors with authority, but the version of me that remembered. The version who knew that medicine was never meant to be sterile, that healing was never just about science. It was always about soul. And in that moment, I knew why I had been allowed to come back. Not to be a hero, not to write a book, but to bear witness, to say, I have seen what we are forgetting, and it is beautiful, and it is not too late. When I returned to my body once again, the clock on the wall hadn't moved, but something eternal inside me had shifted forever. Waking up that morning was different, not just because I felt rested or because my body no longer ached, but because I knew. I knew with a clarity that cut through everything I'd ever believed. I had not come back just to survive. I had come back to serve, but not in the way I once did. I wasn't the same doctor who walked into that operating room weeks ago. That version of me had died, and thank God he had. Because the man who rose in his place no longer cared about prestige or titles or what the board of directors thought about patient quotas. I didn't need to be the smartest in the room. I needed to be the truest, to myself, to the people who trusted me, to the source who gave me another chance. Still, I had no roadmap. How do you bring the invisible into a system built only for the physical? How do you speak of the soul in a field that barely acknowledges its existence? You start small. You begin with presence. My first day back at the hospital, I walked the halls slowly. I greeted the janitor by name. I looked into the eyes of the receptionist and said, "Thank you." These were the people I had passed by countless times, but now I saw them. And then I walked into my first patient's room, a middle-aged woman with autoimmune disease. I had treated her before. She was polite, quiet, compliant with medication. The kind of patient the system likes because she doesn't ask too many questions. But I did. "Tell me," I said gently, "what do you feel your body is trying to say to you?" She looked confused at first. Then her eyes filled with tears. No doctor had ever asked her that, and that was the beginning. I didn't abandon science. I still read charts. I still used all the tools I had been trained with, but I also listened with something deeper than my ears. I asked about grief, about guilt, about memories trapped in the body like forgotten letters, and I began to notice something miraculous. The more patients felt seen, the more their bodies responded. Not always with complete cures, but with shifts, with lightness, with life. Word spread slowly. Some colleagues rolled their eyes. Others warned me I was treading into unscientific territory. But I didn't fight them. I simply kept being what I now knew to be real. And quietly, something began to change. Nurses started asking me questions about how to talk to patients differently. Residents began staying after rounds to hear more about my experience. Even a few hardened specialists began to soften. Not because I preached, but because they felt something. I realized that my near-death experience had not just been for me. It was a seed, planted in a place where it could grow in silence and stillness, and then blossom through the simple act of living differently. I no longer needed to prove the soul existed. I just needed to treat people like they had one. And slowly, medicine became something sacred again. In the evenings, I began writing, not just to process what had happened, but to offer it to anyone who might be standing at the edge of mystery, too afraid to look. I didn't share everything. Some truths are too holy for public display, but I shared what I could, from the heart. People wrote to me from all over. Some were terminally ill. Others were doctors on the brink of quitting. A few were skeptics who admitted that something about what I said stirred something ancient in them. They weren't responding to my credentials. They were responding to the truth behind my words, the recognition that what I had seen wasn't fantasy. It was something they had always known, deep down, but had forgotten, just like I had. And so, my mission became clear, not to convert, not to convince, but to remember out loud, so others could remember too. Because when you remember who you really are, healing becomes inevitable. Not always of the body, but always of the soul. And that is the beginning of real medicine. It's a strange thing, watching a system begin to soften. Hospitals aren't built for softness. They're made of steel, fluorescent light, routines, and rules. But something was changing, and it wasn't just inside me. It started in small ways. A nurse who used to rush through her shift paused longer in her patients' rooms. A physician who prided himself on stoicism shared a personal story during morning rounds. A medical student stayed behind after a lecture, not to ask a clinical question, but to whisper, "Do you really believe the soul continues after death?" Something sacred had been stirred. And it wasn't because I told people what to believe. It was because I loved differently. Not the kind of love you read about in textbooks or see in movies. This love wasn't dramatic or loud. It was presence, attention, reverence. A way of being that said, "I see you." Not your illness, not your diagnosis, you. It amazed me how rare that kind of love had become in medicine. We were trained to be detached. Professional, we called it. But in truth, we were afraid. Afraid to feel too much. Afraid that if we opened our hearts, we'd break under the weight of all that suffering. But I had seen what waited on the other side of death, and I no longer feared breaking. I feared not loving enough while I had the chance. One day I sat with a woman in her 70s. Advanced cancer, stage 4. She had maybe weeks left. The family wanted aggressive treatment, but her eyes told a different story. So I sat beside her bed and asked, "What would bring you peace right now?" She turned to me and said softly, "For someone to stop trying to fix me and just let me be." So I stayed. I held her hand. We didn't talk much. She shared a memory of her late husband. I shared something about my daughter's laugh. And in that moment, something holy happened. She wasn't cured, but she was healed. I could feel it. So could she. She passed away a few days later, but not in fear. She was at peace. And when her daughter hugged me after, she whispered through tears, "You gave her the goodbye we all needed." That's when I knew. Love is the medicine we've been afraid to prescribe. It doesn't come in a bottle. It can't be reimbursed by insurance. But it is the only thing that truly heals what most people are dying from: disconnection. And slowly, others began to notice. Patients started requesting me, not because I had a better track record, but because they felt safe in my care. Administrators couldn't understand why our wing had fewer patient complaints, lower readmission rates, but those of us on the inside knew. It wasn't new technology or policies. It was connection. Eventually, I was asked to speak. First to small groups of residents, then to wider staff meetings, and finally, I stood in front of a national medical conference. My topic? What if love belonged in the operating room? Some scoffed, some leaned in, but I spoke the truth anyway. I told them that the greatest shift we need in medicine isn't more knowledge. It's more wisdom. Not more answers, but more listening. Not more speed, but more presence. And I told them what I now knew in every fiber of my being, that we are not machines. We are souls, walking around in bodies that are constantly trying to tell the truth our lips won't say. That pain is often the voice of a wound we've ignored. That illness can be a portal, not just a problem. And that sometimes, love is the only thing that brings the soul back into the body. After that talk, a cardiologist approached me quietly. He didn't say much, just looked at me and said, "Thank you. I needed to hear that. I haven't felt like a doctor in years." Neither had I realized. Not until I let my heart be part of my practice again. And now, I wasn't just helping people survive. I was helping them return to themselves. Sometimes, I still wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, breath caught halfway between worlds. Not in fear, but in awe, as if some part of me is still there, still walking the halls of that realm where time bends and truth breathes in the light. I never asked to die. I certainly didn't expect to come back with a message. But when you've been to the other side of breath and return with your soul cracked wide open, you don't go back to business as usual. You go back with a mission, not a loud one, not some crusade, but a mission written in silence, in presence, in choosing love over fear, again and again and again. People often ask me, "What was the most important thing you learned over there?" And I always answer the same way, that we've had it backward. We chase success as if it's salvation. We value performance over presence. We glorify knowledge and neglect wisdom. We treat the body, but ignore the soul. We try to live as if we'll never die, and we die as if we never truly lived. But on the other side, all of that falls away. Over there, what matters is simple. Did you love? Did you show up with your whole heart? Did you help others remember who they are? That's it. There are no titles, no resumes, no awards, just the pure resonance of your choices. And I came back to tell you this. It's not too late. No matter where you are on your path, no matter how far you've strayed from your own soul, there's still time to turn back inward, to remember, to begin again. I used to think my job as a doctor was to fix people, to diagnose, to cut, to prescribe, to heal. Now I know the truth. My job is to love them. And sometimes love looks like a diagnosis. Sometimes it looks like surgery. But most of the time, it just looks like being with someone. holding their pain without rushing to erase it, bearing witness to their story without trying to rewrite it, reminding them, in how I sit, in how I speak, in how I see them, that they are not alone. Because when people feel seen, something unlocks inside, and healing, real healing, can begin. As I speak these words, I imagine someone out there, maybe you, feeling a familiar stirring in your chest. Maybe you've always sensed there's something more. Maybe you've lost someone and wondered where they went. Maybe you've felt that quiet pull toward something deeper, something sacred, but you've never had a name for it. Let me be the one to tell you that something is real, and it's calling you home, not to religion, not to dogma, but to truth, to love, to the quiet, knowing that you are more than skin and bones and blood. You are a soul, eternal, unbreakable, worthy. And if you're still here, reading this, listening to this, then your story isn't over yet. There's more for you, more to live, more to give, more to remember. You don't have to die to awaken. You just have to listen, to slow down, to breathe, to ask the deeper questions, and to stop running from the answers your heart already knows. That's what I came back to say. That life is not about how long you live. It's about how fully you live. And that the greatest act of courage is to live with your soul open, even when the world tells you to shut it down. So if anything in my story has resonated with you, if some part of you feels like it's been seen, held, remembered, then I invite you to stay on this journey with me. Because this isn't the end of my story, and maybe it's the beginning of yours. If this message touched your heart in any way, I invite you to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs it. Not for the algorithm, but for the soul. Let's build a world where we remember together. One story, one heart, one truth at a time.